The loudspeaker echoed through the busy terminal, but the quiet words of the flight attendant cut through the calm like a blade. "Sir, we need you to give up this seat for a VIP passenger." In that instant, everything froze. Curious eyes turned toward a middle-aged man, calm in his navy blazer, a simple grey shirt underneath, dark jeans and polished leather shoes. No one in the first-class cabin of that flight from Dallas knew that the man was Ethan Caldwell, 45 years old, CEO of Caldwell Systems, a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. He had just left Phoenix after signing a historic deal. But instead of enjoying a moment of peace on his way back to San Diego, he had become the center of a bizarre power play. Ethan had no entourage, no assistant shadowing him, only a small black suitcase and a worn leather briefcase. He was used to traveling light, blending into the crowd, never ostentatious. At 45, he had mastered the art of being quiet but commanding. Seat 1A for him was never just a spacious first-class seat. It was a symbol of stability, a small anchor in the relentless whirlwind of business travel. Each time he sat down, he felt he had regained control over a fragment of the chaos outside. But today, that seat had become a battlefield. From the back of the cabin came a young figure, Ryan Whitmore, 28, tall, with sunlit blonde hair, stylish sunglasses perched on his head. His pale blue shirt sleeves were rolled high, every movement radiating confidence, as if the entire plane had been built just to serve him. Ryan said nothing. He simply stood there, arms folded, lips curled in a smug smile. It was enough to make clear. Seat 1A should have been his. The petite flight attendant, her voice polite but taut with strain, leaned down beside Ethan. "I'm sorry. There has been a mix-up. This seat is reserved for that special passenger. If you would kindly move to 3C, we will make sure you are served just as well." Ethan looked straight at her. His voice was calm, neither raised nor lowered, but carried the weight of certainty. "My ticket clearly says Seat 1A. I booked it weeks ago. Why should I move now?" The attendant faltered, her eyes flicking toward Ryan, who still stood there like a king waiting for his path to be cleared. The air grew heavy. Conversations around the cabin dimmed, but every ear strained to listen. Some passengers pretended to read magazines, others bent to tie their shoes, but their eyes kept darting toward 1A. Finally, a woman seated across the aisle spoke up. Margaret Lewis, 63, could not hold back. "Why should he move? He is sitting exactly where his ticket says." Her voice was firm, like a bell that shattered the silence and tightened the tension. Ethan froze for a moment, memories flooding back. Networking events where people brushed past him as if he were a junior employee. Meetings where he was mistaken for an assistant until they realized the signature on the contract was his. 20 years of building a career had taught him to live with being underestimated. But he also knew there are moments you must stand up, because those moments do not define just 1 hour, but a lifetime. Ethan raised his head, eyes locked on the attendant. "I will not leave this seat." A strained smile flickered across her lips before she turned away, leaving the air stretched thin like a taut string. Ryan's smugness soured into irritation, his lips pressed tight, while Margaret leaned toward Ethan with an encouraging glance. The others returned to their magazines and phones, but the cabin's atmosphere had shifted. Everyone knew this was only the prelude to a much longer standoff. None of them knew that the man sitting quietly in 1A held the fate of the airline itself. Caldwell Systems powered Western skies. Airlines at its core, from flight schedules and maintenance to crew management, and none of them knew that a decision made in this moment, one that seemed so small, could become the costliest mistake in the airline's history. Ethan leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the window, his lips pressed tight as if to hold back the storm rising inside. He did not need to shout. He did not need to flaunt his power. All he needed was to keep his seat. Outside, the sunset spread across the Dallas runway. A hidden flame had just been lit, a flame that would burn away the arrogance Ryan and the airline itself had mistaken for power. Footsteps pounded against the soft carpet of first class. Ethan had just closed his eyes, seeking a moment of calm, when a deep, commanding voice sounded right beside him. "Mr. Caldwell, there has been a serious mistake. We need you to change your seat immediately." The speaker was David Harper, the tall, stern-faced chief attendant whose tone carried the weight of an order. Behind him trailed the same flight attendant from earlier, her expression a mix of tension and unease. Ethan opened his eyes. He lifted his head, his gaze cold but steady. "A mistake for you, or for me?" David leaned closer, trying to soften his tone, though the authority still cut through. "Seat 1A has been assigned to a special customer. Mr. Whitmore here is a VIP Platinum member. This is important for today's operations." From near the cabin door, Ryan Whitmore stepped forward, wearing a thin smile and eyes full of challenge. He tapped his fingers lightly against the seat and said coldly, "I fly this route every week. This seat has always been mine. Nothing personal, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan turned toward him, his voice low and unshaken. "Nothing personal. When someone demands I give up a seat I paid for simply because they want it, that is personal." The air thickened. Every gaze in first class fixed on the front row. A middle-aged man, Thomas Reed, folded his magazine and said loudly, "The ticket decides the seat. End of story." More voices chimed in. Margaret Lewis, the older woman across the aisle, added sharply, "That young man has not even asked politely. This entire thing is nonsense." David Harper hesitated. He had not expected this wave of support for Ethan. Yet instead of yielding, he leaned closer, lowering his voice, though still loud enough for several passengers to hear. "If you do not cooperate, this flight will be delayed. You will cause inconvenience for everyone." Ethan leaned back, his eyes calm, lips curving into the faintest smile. "Then delay it. I will not give up my seat." His words landed like a gavel striking, making the air heavier still. Some passengers murmured in frustration, worried about delays, but others nodded firmly in agreement. Ryan Whitmore's grip tightened on the strap of his leather bag, his smug smile twisted into irritation. The idea that an ordinary, middle-aged man dared to defy his unspoken privilege was hard for him to accept. David turned and walked away, leaving behind a parting remark that carried more threat than promise. "We will resolve this immediately." Ethan knew what resolve meant. They would return with someone higher up, adding more pressure. He drew a deep breath, his palm gripping the armrest. Memories surged. Times he had been dismissed in meetings, ignored at gatherings. But this was different. This was not just a seat. This was dignity. In the back, Margaret watched him quietly, admiration shining in her eyes. She recognized that he was no ordinary man. There was a regal calmness hidden in every word, every look. Minutes later, David returned. This time accompanied by a man in a suit with a gleaming nameplate. Richard Collins, ground supervisor. He forced a stiff smile, but his voice was loud, clearly meant for the entire cabin to hear. "Mr. Caldwell, to ensure this flight departs on time, we are requesting that you move to another seat. If you refuse, we will be forced to take stronger measures." The cabin erupted in murmurs. Some passengers gasped. What had begun as a small issue had now escalated into a public confrontation. Ethan set his documents down on the table and looked directly at Richard. "You are asking me to give up a seat I purchased legally, to hand it over to someone who merely claims to be VIP. Do you realize this is not procedure? This is a public humiliation." His voice was steady, but sharp as steel. Silence fell across the cabin. All eyes turned toward Richard, then to Ryan, whose arrogance had already begun to crumble. Margaret tapped her armrest and spoke out. "This is the true disruption, not because of him, but because you are forcing a paying customer to endure injustice." Thomas Reed nodded firmly. "That's right. The ticket decides the seat. Let the flight depart." Richard Collins pressed his lips together, the forced smile gone. He muttered through clenched teeth. "Very well. Stay in your seat. But do not forget. This will be recorded." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving behind a silence thick with tension. Ethan closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the seat. He did not need to win in this moment. He only needed not to lose. One thought echoed in his mind. They had no idea that seat 1A they tried to take would become the most expensive seat in the airline's history. The intercom suddenly crackled through the cabin, the chief attendant's voice booming, deliberate and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are finalizing seating arrangements. Thank you for your patience." The phrase "seating arrangements" rang like a warning bell. Everyone understood. The matter of seat 1A was far from over. Ethan opened his eyes. He sat motionless, but every muscle was taut like steel cables. His calm was not submission. It was the compressed weight of a storm waiting to break. Minutes later, Richard Collins, the ground supervisor, returned. This time he no longer wore the mask of forced courtesy. Beside him strode David Harper, tall and alluring. His heavy steps meant to block any resistance. Richard stood squarely in the aisle, his voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Mr. Caldwell, this is the final time. We need you to vacate seat 1A for our priority member. If you refuse, we will have no choice but to remove you from the aircraft." First class erupted in whispers. Murmurs spread, phones discreetly lifted into recording positions. Eyes crossed in every direction, some sympathetic, some curious, some filled with disdain. Ryan Whitmore leaned casually against the wall nearby, a half, smile tugging at his lips as if victory was already his. Ethan set his folder on the table, lifted his head, and spoke in a steady voice that carried across the cabin. "Let me make this clear. I purchased a first-class ticket for seat 1A weeks ago. I arrived on time, boarded according to procedure. You now want to force me out of my rightful seat simply to please someone else. And you are turning it into a public humiliation. Tell me, who exactly is causing the disruption here?" The cabin fell into silence. No one moved. His words cut like an indictment, exposing the truth. From across the aisle, Margaret Lewis struck her hand against the armrest. "This is blatant injustice. You are abusing authority." Thomas Reed rose halfway from his seat, his voice sharp as ice. "He is right. Do you want this flight to depart, or to become a spectacle on social media?" Another passenger muttered, "I've recorded everything." The phone hidden beneath his newspaper was still capturing. Richard Collins faltered, his eyes darting toward the small lenses and curious stares. What he had not anticipated was that the truth was no longer in his hands, but in the hands of witnesses. Ethan leaned forward, his voice lower now but resonating with power. "You can drag me out. But when you do, remember this. You are dragging a fully paid, compliant passenger from his lawful seat just to appease someone else. Are you prepared to see that image spread everywhere?" Richard pressed his lips together, the forced smile gone, doubt flickering in his eyes. Seeing the shift, Ryan Whitmore broke in. "Enough. I am VIP, and this airline knows what value I bring. This seat is mine. He should know his place." The words spilled raw, dripping with arrogance. The cabin froze. Ryan had said aloud what everyone already sensed. This was no mistake. It was discrimination. Ethan turned his head, fixing Ryan with a long stare. No anger, no shouting. Only a steady gaze, sharp as a blade. "Perhaps it is you who doesn't know whose place this really is." For a fleeting moment, Ryan flinched. His smug smile wavered, as if some instinct warned him that there was far more hidden beneath the ordinary exterior of this man. At last, Richard Collins drew a deep breath and stepped back. "Very well. Remain where you are. We will find another solution." He turned away, his face darkened, leaving behind a simmering storm in the cabin. Ethan leaned back, eyes on the window. The engines rumbled, preparing for takeoff. But within him, a decision had already formed. This battle did not end here. It had only just begun. The plane touched down in San Diego just as the sunset faded, giving way to the night that draped itself over the coastal city. The pale yellow lights of the runway reflected against the windows, stretching like fragmented memories across Ethan Caldwell's mind. He waited until most passengers had disembarked before rising. Ryan Whitmore avoided his eyes, slipping quickly out of the cabin, like a man who had just lost a game he thought was already won. Margaret Lewis paused before leaving, offering Ethan a small nod, her eyes glowing with admiration. Yet instead of relief, Ethan felt only a cold emptiness in his chest. He had kept his seat, but the public humiliation lingered like a wound that refused to close. A black sedan waited at the terminal. The driver, Michael Torres, smiled warmly as always and asked, "Good flight, sir." Ethan hesitated for a moment. He could not speak the truth. He simply answered, "We've arrived." In the car, street lights flickered across his face, casting fleeting shadows across his somber features. His phone buzzed constantly, emails pouring in with updates on the Phoenix deal that had just been secured. It should have been cause for celebration, yet tonight nothing felt like victory. Later, in his kitchen, a glass of cold water sat heavy in his hand, like evidence. Each time he closed his eyes, Ryan's smug grin and Richard Collins's threats echoed again. Ethan's mind drifted back to his early years, meetings where he was mistaken for a logistics clerk, conferences where people turned their backs because he did not fit the image of a millionaire CEO. He had ignored it all, pouring everything into building Caldwell systems. But this time was different. They had not only dismissed him, they had deliberately made him the subject of humiliation in front of an entire first-class cabin. This was no longer about a seat. It was about a system that judged human worth and deemed him unworthy. He set the glass down, the sound of it striking the table sharp and hollow. In his mind, a thought crystallized into resolve. Someone would have to pay. Ethan picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. On the other end came a weary, gravelly voice. "Still at the office?" It was Daniel Cross, the loyal COO of Caldwell Systems. "Yes," Daniel replied. "I'm reviewing the Phoenix reports. What's going on?" Ethan sank into his chair, his voice low, almost icy. "I need the entire contract with Western Skies Airlines. Every clause, every deadline, every dependency they have on our systems, as detailed as possible." Silence lingered for a few seconds. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice subdued. "What happened, Ethan?" Ethan stared into the darkness of the kitchen, his eyes no longer burning with anger, but frozen with the clarity of a plan. "I'll tell you tomorrow morning. Be ready. Tomorrow, we begin." After ending the call, Ethan leaned back in his chair. For the first time that evening, his heartbeat steadied. The raw sting of humiliation slowly transformed into something else: resolve. He was not chasing petty revenge. He would show Western Skies that their decision to cast him aside that day would become the costliest seat in their history. The glow of the city lights spilled through the window, painting broken patterns across the wooden floor. Ethan closed his eyes and whispered, "They think I am just a passenger. But tomorrow, they will know who I am." In the stillness of the kitchen, those words echoed like an oath. And from that moment, the fate of an airline began to move into the storm. Dawn stretched across the glass towers of San Diego. The sun rose slowly, pale gold, yet sharp as a blade. The headquarters of Caldwell Systems rose in the center of the city like a massive block of crystal. Ethan Caldwell walked through the main lobby, his stride straight, his face betraying no emotion. The receptionist greeted him with a bow, and he responded only with a faint nod. Inside him, however, a storm was waiting to be unleashed. The 20th floor boardroom gleamed with sunlight pouring through the glass. On the table, stacks of thick documents were neatly arranged. Daniel Cross, the COO, stood waiting, dark circles under his eyes from working through the night. "Here is the full contract with Western Skies Airlines," Daniel said, sliding the heavy folder across the table like a law book. "They depend on us for everything: scheduling, maintenance, even crew management. If our system stalls, they will fall into chaos in just a few hours. Ethan turned page after page, his eyes like blades cutting through every detail. He asked quietly, "If we pull back priority, how many other carriers are ready to sign for the same services?" Daniel gave a weary smile, tinged with calculation. "At least 3. 2 of them are Western Sky's direct competitors. They have been waiting for this chance for a long time." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his voice low but sharp. "Starting today, Western Skies goes to the bottom of the list. No more extra services, no more expedited support. We deliver exactly what the contract requires, nothing more. Our resources will shift to those 3 carriers." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Do you want to give them advance notice?" Ethan shook his head, a cold smile flickering across his lips. "No. Let them discover it themselves, and when they do, they will understand. That seat 1A they tried to take from me has become the most expensive seat in their history." Silence filled the room. The hum of the air conditioner, the sound of pages turning, all carried the weight of thunder. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting both admiration and unease. "You are not just retaliating. You are teaching them a lesson." Ethan tightened his grip on the folder, his gaze fixed on the city blazing with morning light. "No, Daniel. I am not doing this over a seat. I am doing it for respect. When they believed they could dismiss me, it meant they believed they could dismiss anyone. And that culture must come with a cost." That very day, the operations team quietly made adjustments. Emergency requests from Western Skies were pushed to the end of the queue. Software updates, once prioritized, now had to wait for the standard schedule. Meanwhile, the client relations department began approaching 2 rival airlines, opening doors for a transfer of services. No one outside the executive circle knew the real reason. But inside Caldwell Systems, the air was tight as a drawn string. By late afternoon, Ethan stood alone in his office, watching the last rays of sunlight stretch across the San Diego Bay. He remembered Ryan's mocking stare, Richard Collins's public threat, and the silent applause of Margaret Lewis. Together, they formed one reminder. Respect is not something to be negotiated. He whispered softly, his deep voice resonating in the empty room. They will learn the hard way. 3 days later, the phones at Caldwell Systems rang non-stop. On the display screens, the Western Skies Airlines logo flashed like a distress signal. Daniel Cross picked up, his voice calm. "Caldwell Systems, this is Cross." On the other end, the frantic voice of a regional manager came through. "The scheduling system is running unusually slow. Our support requests haven't been processed. At this rate, several flights will be delayed." Daniel glanced at Ethan, who stood silently with arms crossed by the window. He answered briefly, "We are processing requests according to contract procedures. Please wait." Hanging up, Daniel gave a half smile. It has begun. Within a week, the picture became clear. Western Skies was faltering. Dozens of flights were delayed because maintenance data updates arrived late. Crew members complained that the shift management app kept freezing. Customers flooded social media with complaints. Meanwhile, rumors spread quickly. Rivals of Western Skies, 2 airlines that had once been bullied by them, suddenly received invitations to partner with Caldwell Systems. Quiet calls were made, draft contracts exchanged. On the chessboard of commerce, the pieces had begun to move. At Western Skies headquarters, Chief Operating Officer Harold Denton stood before the boardroom, sweat beading on his forehead. His voice cracked as he reported, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing severe delays. Caldwell Systems no longer treats us as before. Something has changed." The airline's CEO, Peter Langford, scowled. "What do you mean? Caldwell has always been our strategic partner. Call them, sign an addendum, pay more, do whatever it takes." But Harold only shook his head. "They said they will honor the contract, nothing more." The air in the boardroom grew heavy as lead. Faces paled, eyes darted away. A silent truth emerged. Western Skies was no longer a priority. In the top floor office in San Diego, Ethan reviewed the reports. On his screen, the list of delayed Western Skies flights stretched on. He did not smile, nor revel in satisfaction. He simply watched, his eyes cold. Daniel asked, "Are you going to meet them? They will beg, you know." Ethan closed his laptop, his voice low yet resounding in the wide office. "No. I want them to piece it together themselves and realize it all began with Seat 1A. As Western Skies spiraled into chaos, their rivals quietly rejoiced. An internal memo circulated. Caldwell Systems is in negotiations with 2 new carriers. Everyone understood what it meant. If the contracts shifted, Western Skies' position would be shaken to its core. And Ryan Whitmore, the man who once stood arrogantly in first class, was now caught in the storm. His father, one of Western Skies' major investors, began to question him. For the first time, Ryan felt the chill of skeptical eyes in the very boardroom where he had once been celebrated. That afternoon, Ethan stood on his office balcony, watching the crimson sunset fall across the bay. He told himself quietly, arrogance always carries a price, and sometimes that price is not just a delayed flight, but an emir brought to its knees. In his eyes, this battle was not revenge, but a lesson carved in fire and steel for those who had dared to dismiss respect. On a Monday morning, the phone rang inside the top-floor boardroom of Caldwell Systems. On the screen, the caller ID glowed. Western Skies headquarters. It was not a call from a hotline or a regional manager, but a direct line from the executive office. Daniel Cross glanced at Ethan, his eyes cautious yet curious. Ethan gave a single nod. "Put it through." A man's voice came on, strained as though trying to mask his tension. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Robert Hale, Chief Operating Officer of Western Skies. We have noticed a clear change in the level of support from Caldwell Systems recently. Perhaps there has been some mistake." Ethan sat upright, his voice low and deliberate. "There is no mistake, Mr. Hale. We are providing exactly what was agreed in the contract. Nothing more." The line went quiet for a moment, before Robert rushed in, his words almost pleading. "We would like to discuss renewing and expanding the contract. We are willing to pay additional fees for priority service again." Ethan allowed a faint smile to touch his lips, a smile unseen, but cold enough to lower the temperature of the room. "You are asking for priority. But priority cannot be bought with money. It is earned through respect, the very thing your company has lost. When the call ended, Daniel let out a heavy breath. You've made them kneel. So what now? Do we accept new terms or push them closer to the edge? Ethan stepped toward the window, looking down at the streams of cars moving like arteries through the city. His voice was firm as stone. We will let them live, but live in constant fear of losing everything at any moment. The contract war will be fulfilled to the letter, but every priority will be shifted to their rivals. When the aviation industry looks on, Western Skies will stand as a lesson in arrogance and the price it commands. Daniel nodded slowly, respect flickering in his eyes. He knew Ethan was not simply striking back. He was teaching an entire industry a lesson. Meanwhile, at Western Skies headquarters, the atmosphere was suffocating, like a courtroom on Judgment Day. Executives argued back and forth, voices rising and falling, fists striking the table. We cannot let Caldwell abandon us, Harold Denton roared. But what choice do we have? Another director whispered. Find another provider, someone suggested weakly, only to be shot down instantly. No one can replace Caldwell, not in the short term, not in the next 6 months. In the corner, CEO Peter Langford sat silent, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew the truth. His company's throat was being squeezed, and the hand closing tighter belonged to the man they had once tried to humiliate on a flight. Whispers leaked through the board. The crisis had begun with a so-called VIP passenger, the one who had dragged the airline into this quiet storm. Eyes turned toward Ryan Whitmore. His father, a major investor, furrowed his brow during the meeting. Is it true you caused trouble on that Dallas flight? Ryan stammered, stripped of his usual arrogance. I only wanted to keep my usual seat. How could I have known? But no one listened further. In the cold stares of the board, Ryan realized the shield of privilege he once relied upon was beginning to crack. That afternoon, Ethan stepped onto his office balcony, the San Diego Bay winds tugging at his suit. He looked out toward the horizon, where the sun burned red as it sank into the water. He spoke softly, as if only to himself. Yet Daniel heard every word. They thought a seat was just a seat. But sometimes a seat can become the grave of an empire. Daniel said nothing. In that moment, he knew Western Skies had only tasted the first drops of bitterness. The true storm was still on its way. Friday morning, a national financial broadcast opened with a bold red headline, Western Skies Airlines in turmoil, mass flight delays, stock plummets. Images filled the screen, passengers crowding terminals, lines stretching endlessly at service counters, tense faces, phones raised for live streams. The sounds of shouting, crying children, and overwhelmed staff echoed in the background. The entire aviation industry was shaken. On social media, the hashtag #NeverFlyWestern surged to the top within hours. A middle-aged man live-streamed from a waiting area. We've been stuck here for 8 hours. They say the crew management system has crashed. I paid for a first-class ticket, and this is how they treat customers. A young woman joined in, her voice trembling with anger. They kicked an honest man out of his seat, and now they can't even run their flight schedules. This is a total collapse. Those videos spread millions of times. Western Skies, once a brand that bragged about priority service, had become a public laughingstock. Journalists quickly uncovered the link. The crisis had begun after a dispute over a first-class seat on a Dallas flight. Several passengers, including Margaret Lewis and Thomas Reed, stepped forward to speak. They described in detail how Western Skies had deliberately humiliated a middle-aged man to appease a young VIP. In an interview, Margaret stated bluntly, "I saw it with my own eyes. They asked him to leave a seat he had already paid for. That was no mistake. It was public disrespect. And now, they're paying the price." The story grew wider. The public no longer saw it as a technical failure, but as a moral reckoning. At Western Skies headquarters, CEO Peter Langford slammed the table during an emergency meeting. "We must handle this PR crisis immediately. Everyone is talking about seat 1A. Find that passenger, send an apology, offer compensation 10 times over." But Harold Denton shook his head in despair. "You don't understand. That wasn't just a passenger. That was Ethan Caldwell, chairman of Caldwell Systems." The room fell silent. Some executives slumped into their chairs, their faces pale. They realized the man they had tried to push out of his seat was the one holding their very lifeline. In his San Diego office, Ethan watched the news on a large screen. The reporter's voice rang out. "Western Skies has lost 12% of its stock value in a single morning. Competitors are seizing the opportunity to capture premium customers. The crisis is believed to have been triggered by the withdrawal of technological support from the Caldwell Systems." Daniel Cross stood beside him with a faint smile. "In just 1 week, they've gone from giant to struggler. So what now, Ethan? Do we step in to save them?" Ethan set down his coffee cup, his eyes fixed on the screen. "No, let them struggle. An arrogant empire must collapse to remember that respect is never optional." The following articles did not just target Western Skies. They named Ryan Whitmore directly. Photos of him in first class, arms crossed, smirking with arrogance, flooded the internet. Headlines asked, "Did an entire airline destroy itself just to please a spoiled VIP?" Ryan became the center of public outrage. Friends abandoned him. Shareholders raged, and even his father, a major investor, was forced to publicly distance himself from the scandal. By late afternoon, golden sunlight bathed Caldwell's office. Ethan stood by the glass, watching seagulls wheel over the bay. He remembered that moment in first class, when the entire crew had stood before him and threatened to drag him out. He whispered firmly, "This is not the end. This is only the beginning." His eyes gleamed, not with hatred, but with the vision of a man turning humiliation into the chance to reshape an entire industry. 2 weeks later, in the midst of a crisis that showed no sign of easing, a thick envelope arrived at the headquarters of Caldwell Systems. Embossed with the Western Skies logo, the handwriting on it trembled with desperation. Ethan Caldwell opened it in his office. Inside was a formal letter, signed by CEO Peter Langford. "Dear Mr. Caldwell, we sincerely apologize for the incident on the Dallas flight. It was an unfortunate misunderstanding. Western Skies values you as both a customer and a partner. We hope to rebuild trust and continue our cooperation in the future." The words were polite, the phrasing softened, but to Ethan they felt cold and hollow. An apology offered only after the damage had exploded, What meaning could it hold? He folded the letter and placed it on the dark wooden desk. Memories surged back. The flight attendant's averted gaze, Richard Collins's threats, Ryan Whitmore's smug grin. Each one vivid, etched into his memory like a scar. He thought silently. If I had not been Ethan Caldwell, if I had been just an ordinary passenger, who would have stood up for me? This letter was not for justice. It was a desperate attempt to salvage a contract that was bleeding out. Late that afternoon, Ethan met Daniel Cross at a small diner by the bay. Daniel stared out toward the horizon, where the sun painted the sea a burning orange, then asked, "What do you plan to do? They're desperate. If we agree, they'll pay any price." Ethan sipped his black coffee, his voice calm but resolute. "We honor the contract until it ends. After that, all resources go to their rivals. Western Skies must learn that respect cannot be patched up with money." Daniel nodded, though unease flickered in his eyes. "Aren't you afraid of being seen as too harsh?" Ethan met his gaze, a faint smile on his lips. "Harsh? No, Daniel. This is justice." Meanwhile, the media continued to dig deeper. One major paper published a photograph of Seat 1A with the headline, "The most expensive seat in Western Skies history." The story had grown beyond a single flight. It had become a symbol. Arrogance could topple an empire. One evening, Ethan dined with his longtime friend, Richard Monroe. After hearing the entire story, Richard set down his silverware and looked straight at him. "You know, Ethan, people think respect is just courtesy. But in truth, it is the foundation. Lose it, and everything collapses." Ethan stayed quiet for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Exactly. And Western Skies learned that lesson in the hardest way." Back at home, Ethan sat in silence, the desk lamp casting light over the apology letter. He did not tear it up, nor did he treat it as something to treasure. He left it there, a piece of evidence of a moment never to be forgotten. He whispered softly, "Not money, not status, but how you treat others when you think no one is watching. That is the true measure of worth." His eyes shone, not with vengeance, but with the clarity of a man who knew he had permanently shifted the balance of power. In August, the contract between Caldwell Systems and Western Skies officially expired. There was no renewal, no new agreement. Every technical resource, from data networks to support teams, shifted to 3 rival airlines that had been waiting years for this opportunity. On the day the announcement was made, Western Skies stock went into freefall. The press called it a fatal blow from Caldwell Systems. Analysts commented, "A decision made in a first-class cabin has rewritten the history of aviation." At Western Skies headquarters, CEO Peter Langford stood before the board, his voice hoarse. "We have lost Caldwell. There is no choice left but to find another provider. But it is too late. They have already partnered with our competitors." The boardroom sank into heavy silence. Hollow eyes, haggard faces, and not a single person dared to speak the name Ryan Whitmore, the man who had turned Seat 1A into the beginning of a nightmare. Meanwhile, on the top floor of Caldwell Systems in San Diego, Ethan Caldwell looked out over the city glowing against the night. Daniel Cross entered, placing on the desk the new contracts signed with 2 rival airlines. "We have not only replaced western skies," Daniel said, pride gleaming in his eyes. "We have surpassed them." Ethan gave a slight nod, his gaze steady. "We did not surpass them. They brought themselves down. We only showed them the price of arrogance." A week later, at an international aviation conference, Ethan was invited to speak. He stood on stage, the spotlight on his charcoal suit, his voice resonant yet calm. "In business, every contract has a price. But there is one thing, if lost, that makes the price impossible to measure. That is respect." He paused, letting the silence fill the hall. Then he continued. "People think a seat is just a place to sit. But sometimes, a seat can decide the fate of an empire. Remember this: respect is not a privilege, it is a foundation. Lose it, and you lose everything." The entire audience rose to their feet in applause. That night, back in his office, Ethan sat alone. He looked at the steaming cup of coffee on his desk and smiled faintly. In his memory, he still heard the threat from that day. "If you do not cooperate, we will remove you from the plane." He whispered, as if closing the chapter for himself. "No one has the right to decide my worth but me. And sometimes the silence of one person can echo louder than any engine." The city lights reflected against the glass. Outside, planes glided across the night sky. In that darkness, Seat 1A was no longer just a seat. It had become a symbol of fairness and dignity. In the world of business, there are contracts worth billions, but none more costly than respect. Ethan Caldwell did not just hold on to a first-class seat. He turned it into a wake-up call for an entire industry. If you believe that dignity should never be up for negotiation, hit like to spread this message and press subscribe so you never miss the next dramatic story. And finally, leave a comment with just 2 words, human dignity, to affirm that you too stand on the side of what is right.